At 65, Jean-Claude Van Damme has finally stopped playing the Hollywood game. The muscles from Brussels has broken his lifelong silence on Chuck Norris, and what he revealed is not a petty grudge or a story about a failed stunt. It is a raw, unsettling look at the man behind the invincible myth. As the world mourns a fallen legend, Van Damme is pulling back the curtain on a truth that changes everything we thought we knew about the ultimate tough guy. Let's be clear about one thing from the start. Van Damme is not insulting the legacy of Chuck Norris. His point is something far more human and far more sobering. Chuck was not the machine the world believed him to be, a man who never felt pain, never aged, and never failed. He was also just a human being. Sitting in a dimly lit corner of a Brussels cafe, Jean-Claude Van Damme doesn't look like the man who once split the world in two with a pair of Volvos. At 65, his face is a rugged map of every high kick, every film set explosion, and every hard-lived mile. There were no handlers present, no PR team scrubbing his sentences, and certainly no Hollywood smile. He looked like a man who had finally decided that the weight of a secret was heavier than any barbell he had ever lifted. When the name Chuck Norris was spoken, the air in the room seemed to thin. For decades, these two were the twin pillars of action cinema, the European aestheticist and the American enforcer. The world assumed they were carved from the same granite. The world was wrong. The revelation Van Damme dropped was not about who would win a real-world sparring match. It was something far more haunting. He revealed that the Chuck Norris the world worshipped, the meme godlike warrior who supposedly doesn't age, he levels up, was a golden cage that Norris refused to leave, even as it began to consume him. Van Damme spoke with hushed, almost reverent intensity about their final private moments, describing a man who had become a total prisoner of his own legend. Chuck couldn't be human anymore, Jean-Claude whispered, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere in the past. The world demanded a superhero, and he was too proud to tell them he was just a man who could bleed. According to Van Damme, the truly painful part of their legendary relationship was not a lack of respect. It was a wall of silence that neither man could scale. While Van Damme spent the last decade being brutally open about his struggles with addiction, bipolar disorder, and the crushing pressure of fame, Norris remained a closed book, a stoic, unmoving statue that refused to crack even when the foundation was crumbling. Jean-Claude recounted a specific, heartbreaking moment behind the scenes during their final years together. He described Norris in clear physical agony, his body finally rebelling against decades of punishing martial arts, yet refusing medical intervention or even a chair to sit on. Why? Because the Chuck Norris the world knew didn't get hurt. This obsession with the myth, Van Damme claims, is what eventually created a void between them. We spent 20 years laughing that death once had a Chuck Norris experience, but Van Damme is here to tell us the opposite was the reality. The unbeatable persona was a mask that never came off, even when the cameras stopped rolling and the lights went dark. It is a profound critique of the toxic pressure of being a cultural icon, a warning that if you play a god long enough, you lose the fundamental ability to be a person. Van Damme's voice cracked slightly when he admitted that he tried to reach out multiple times toward the end. He wanted to tell Chuck it was okay to be 86 and fragile. He wanted to tell him that the fans would love the man just as much as the legend. But the wall Norris had built was too high, fortified by a lifetime of being the man. The revelation is, in its essence, a heartbreak, the realization that two of the toughest men on the planet couldn't find the internal strength to be vulnerable with each other until the clock had run out. To understand how these two men ended up in the same cage, you have to go back to the beginning, before the world-famous splits, before the millions of dollars, and before the memes. Long before Jean-Claude was the muscles from Brussels, he was just a skinny, incredibly flexible kid from Belgium with a thick accent and a dream that everyone in Hollywood laughed at. The man who didn't laugh was Chuck Norris. When Van Damme first arrived in Los Angeles, he wasn't headlining films. He was barely eating. He was sleeping in his car, doing odd jobs, and trying to convince anyone who would listen that he was the next Bruce Lee. It was during this desperate period that he crossed paths with Norris. At the time, Chuck was already a massive star, the king of the lone wolf action flick. He owned a famous spot called Woody's Wharf in Newport Beach and needed someone who could handle themselves if things got rowdy. He hired the young Belgian as a bouncer. One of the most famous movie stars in history was literally standing outside a bar, checking IDs and breaking up fights. Van Damme often recounts those nights with a mix of nostalgia and reverence. Chuck saw something in him, that raw, explosive, kicking ability, and invited him to be a sparring partner. This wasn't Hollywood sparring where you pull your punches for the camera. This was old school, full contact training in Chuck's private gym. Van Damme describes those sessions as a baptism by fire. Chuck didn't coddle him. He pushed him to his absolute physical limit, teaching him the discipline required to move from a competitive karateka to a cinematic icon. It was Chuck who gave Jean-Claude his first real break in the business, helping him land a small role as a stuntman and extra in the 1984 film Missing in Action. For Van Damme, Chuck was a godfather figure, the blueprint for what a martial arts superstar should be. But as the 90s rolled in, the dynamic shifted. Van Damme's career exploded with Bloodsport and Kickboxer. Suddenly the student was a rival. While they never had a public feud, the distance began to grow. Van Damme became the face of a new school, flashier, more emotional, and admittedly more chaotic. Meanwhile, Chuck stayed in his lane, becoming the face of Walker, Texas Ranger, leaning into the stern, invincible lawman persona that would eventually define his entire legacy. The tragedy Van Damme hints at actually started here. As their paths diverged, the way they handled fame could not have been more different. Van Damme's life became a public soap opera. He crashed, he burned, he went to rehab, and he came back. He was human, messy, and loud about it. Chuck, however, doubled down on the invincible image. Even when they reunited on screen decades later for The Expendables 2, the tension was palpable. Van Damme recalls that the atmosphere changed the moment Chuck arrived on set. While the rest of the cast, Stallone, Schwarzenegger, Willis, were joking around and laughing at their own fading hairlines, Chuck remained apart. He had his own rules and his own aura. Van Damme looked at his old mentor and didn't see the man who used to sweat with him in the Newport Beach gym. He saw a man who had become a statue of himself. "I wanted to hug him," Jean-Claude said. "I wanted to say, hey, remember when we were just two guys kicking a heavy bag? But you couldn't get close to him. He was Chuck Norris now. He wasn't Chuck anymore." Van Damme realized that while he had been saved by his own vulnerability, by admitting he was broken, Chuck was being crushed by his own strength. He was trapped in a loop of having to be the toughest man in the room, even when his knees were failing and his breath was short. The very man who taught Van Damme how to be a star was the one who couldn't figure out how to stop being one. The news hit the world like a roundhouse kick no one saw coming. On March 19, 2026, the legend himself passed away at the age of 86 in Hawaii. For a generation that grew up believing Norris was literally immortal, thanks to a decade of internet memes claiming death was too afraid to even knock on his door, the reality of his passing felt like a glitch in the universe. Just days earlier, on his 86th birthday, he had posted a video of himself sparring, looking every bit the indestructible warrior the world wanted him to be. But as his family's official statement landed on Instagram, the tone shifted from disbelief to heavy, collective grief. They described him as a symbol of strength to the world, but to them he was a husband, a father, and the heart of a home. The tributes poured in almost instantly. Sylvester Stallone called him all-American in every way. Arnold Schwarzenegger called him a badass, in real life and in Hollywood. Even the official Bruce Lee account posted a haunting throwback photo from The Way of the Dragon, simply captioned "Rest in Peace," a full-circle moment for a man whose career began in Bruce Lee's shadow and ended as a titan in his own right. But among all the high-profile condolences, it was Van Damme's reaction that felt the most complex. While others spoke of the icon and the badass, Jean-Claude's tribute hinted at deeper, more troubled waters. He didn't just see the movie star. He saw the man who had mentored him 40 years prior and then drifted away behind a wall of impenetrable Chuck Norris facts. To understand the full weight of Van Damme's revelation, you have to grasp the sheer